Now going to introduce Professor David Sweanor, who I feel lucky and blessed to have known him, and he has taken on a mentorship role for me in the world of vaping and advocating for access for tobacco harm reduction. I think, sorry, David, I hope you don't blush, but I think you are.
That's charming.
Okay. You just have a way of saying things that make it relatable and just motivate me to say, yeah, I can do that. And I just want to share a few little things about David. If you don't know, he's testified on tobacco issues before numerous national legislative bodies, including both bodies of the US Congress. He's the recipient of the Outstanding Individual Philanthropist Award in Ottawa in 2016. He has received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Pan American Health Organization. He's been legal counsel on Non-Smokers' Rights Association from 1983 to 2005. Global Leadership, Boston University School of Public Health. He's the adjunct, did I say that right? Adjunct professor, Faculty of Law, University of Ottawa. He's chair of the advisory board for the Center of Health Law, Policy and Ethics, University of Ottawa. He's been the author or editor of numerous publications by such bodies of WHO, World Bank, CDC, National Cancer Institute, and American Cancer Society. Here's the thing is, and he's from Port Hope, Ontario, which I think is really important because I'm currently in Port Hope, Ontario. The other thing that I think is really important to understand is many of these anti-organizations that are coming out against vaping, David has worked with them for decades in regards to anti-smoking. So I think there was a split that happened, which I'm always fascinated about. That one group of tobacco control went, you know what, let's find harm reduction, let's get behind harm reduction. Mm-hmm. And then another went completely the other way. So I don't know if David will get into that a little bit, but I think that's important to see is that, David's been on both sides, has worked with both sides. And I think that's an interesting perspective that not many of us will ever have. So I'm going to hand it over to you, David, so you can discuss what you think about this legislative review that's going on and kind of walk us through this.
Sure. I mean, I can start by talking a little bit about this division within the what used to be the anti-smoking community, in that it's not something that is very very difficult to understand, and it's actually very common on lots of issues, where the history of progress on public health has been all about some pretty simple things like listen to the people whose health is at risk, empower them, give them the information that they need, use science and technology in ways that that advances the agenda, tie into what's going on to try to ride that. And if we look at the history of why is life expectancy in Canada like twice what it was 120 years ago? Well, it's because of primarily preventive medicine, public health measures, having sanitary food, clean water, regulating pharmaceuticals to get away from snake oil, safer automobiles. The death rate in automobile accidents now in Canada is down by about 85% since the time I was a teenager growing up in Port Hope. We have far safer airplanes. We have buildings that are less likely to fall down or catch on fire. We've just, wherever we see risk, we try to reduce it. And it's a very pragmatic thing. It's essentially the principles of the Enlightenment. You try to use science and reason and humanism. You seek truth. You do things to advance the well-being of the people around you. And it works really, really well. But it's almost always opposed by people for other reasons. So people who look at things in a more moralistic way, where some of us may see a health risk, they see a sin. So if we look at the history of dealing with drugs, is it the sort of thing we're now trying to do to reduce the risk of things like opioids? Or is it a matter of a war on drugs because they're evil and you're sinful if you use them? We went through the same thing on sexual behaviors. You know, is being gay something that we need to protect people from the illnesses that might be transmitted, smited. Bicycles, I mean, in the late 1800s, 1890s, as bicycles, as we know them, became popular, there was moral outrage about this. I mean, which surprises a lot of people. But, you know, you think about it, you know, what if a woman rode a bicycle? I mean, she might be wearing bloomers, like, rather than a long dress. I mean, my gosh, what if a gentleman is riding a bicycle and passes a lady on the street? And if he's a gentleman, he should tip his hat. But if he tips his hat, he might fall off the bicycle. But if he doesn't tip his hat, he's giving a social indication he doesn't consider her to be a lady. Well, imagine what would happen to her reputation, the reputation of her family. What if a couple is courting and they're on bicycles? They could get out of sight of the chaperone. Oh, imagine what would happen. You know, we need to ban these things. And indeed, I think Victoria, British Columbia is one of the places that did ban women from riding bicycles. But we've gone through this on so many issues. I mean, car safety, the same thing. We deal with it on diet. You know, is being overweight a health issue, a lifestyle issue, or is it a sin? And people need to be punished for that. So with issues of nicotine and tobacco, there are many people who really think that they're trying to smite evil. That this is a sin, they have to fight it, and you don't give in to sin. You don't compromise on sin. So it isn't like you can go to a confession and say to the priest that, you know, there's somebody I really want to kill, Father. I mean, I really want to murder him. But, you know, if you cut me some slack and let me covet my neighbor's wife, you know, I might do that instead. Is that okay? And it's no. I mean, it's all sin. You got to not sin. There's also conspiracy theories. A lot of people in tobacco control got into thinking that this is a fight against the tobacco industry, and the tobacco industry is evil personified. Many of these people can't even define what they mean by the tobacco industry, and few of them know anything about it. I mean, speaking as someone who was a member of a successful team that suing tobacco companies, you need to actually understand your enemy if you're going to win. And I'm amazed at the people who feel that they're fighting an enemy that they don't know. They see everything as a conspiracy. They would see Maria as part of the tobacco industry because she happens to have a vape shop. They understand very little about the motivations. If a tobacco company says we're trying to get into vaping, they will attack vaping without saying, well, wait a minute, they make their money from cigarettes. Vaping is actually an existential threat to big tobacco. For all sorts of business, profit reasons, litigation reasons, regulation reasons, it's a huge threat. But you've got people who don't understand them. They're just attacking them. They're the bad guy. So it's a very frustrating thing to try to deal with this, but I think everybody should know that this is common. I mean, this is just how it goes on all of these issues. And I could go on at length about all the other ones where this division between people who see a moralistic, behavioralist sort of problem and people who see a health problem that needs a pragmatic solution. And I'm hoping that we can all be part of that pragmatic solution. So with that in mind, I mean, we've got legislation that I was involved in the original legislation on restricting cigarette advertising, promotion, getting warnings back in the 80s. I've been involved with, globally on many of the things on cigarettes, trying to get measures that will actually reduce use. It became very obvious by the, if not by Mike Russell's work in the 1970s, that people smoke in order to get nicotine, but they die because of the smoke. It became clear that many of the things that we were doing to simply try to drive down demand for cigarettes without giving people alternatives were having limited success. And that makes sense, given that you've got an awful lot of people who are using a product, dependent on the product, like the product, whatever's going on, but to try to get them to completely quit any form of tobacco or nicotine, quit it immediately and quit it forever was quite a reach. And we started seeing the evidence from places like Sweden, where people were using the oral tobacco product snus, that it had minimal health risks. It was replacing cigarettes, and they had the lowest rates of cigarette use, the lowest rates of tobacco-caused illness anywhere in the European Union by a long shot. It was substitution. Just like we substitute safer cars for more dangerous cars, we substitute safer drugs for the hazardous ones. You know, we substitute products, behaviors, services, because we're trying to reduce risk. You know, and as products came available that better met the needs of people who would otherwise smoke, you know, there was a revolution afoot, and vaping is the best example of that. Because there was this huge market, you know, globally, the sales of cigarettes are somewhere in the range of $1 trillion Canadian dollars equivalent per year, trillion with a T. If you can get a tiny part of that market, if you can get like 1/10,000th of that market, you become a billionaire. So there's a huge incentive for people to look at, well, wait a minute, what is it about this product that people don't like? Well, it kills them, it makes them stink, costs them an awful lot of money. Maybe we can get something that doesn't kill them, doesn't make them stink, and doesn't cost as much. We could become phenomenally wealthy. So lots of people were looking at products they could have that would revolutionize this the way sanitary food revolutionized diets. And as these products came forward, you had that opposition for the people who see sin. Because if you see an activity as sinful, as bad, as evil, the last thing you want is to see that activity being able to done in a way that doesn't harm people, right? You know, if those of us who've been around long enough remember on some of the issues when AIDS emerged, those who thought this is fantastic because this will teach people for being homosexual. And the last thing they want is somebody to be able to have safe sex, because it was the sex they didn't like, not the disease. So we ended up with the sort of battle that we have. And I think it's, as I think is really obvious, if you hear me speak or look at many things I've written, I think it's deplorable that we have people calling themselves health groups who are doing things that are anti-health. I think it's deplorable that we have health departments that don't follow basic public health principles on things like the Ottawa Charter of Health, which the World Health Organization has adopted on health promotion. And it's basic things like meet people where they are, understand their lived experience, empower them to make better decisions about their own health, work with them, engage with them. And yet we will find many of the people who most attack vaping have never been in a vape shop. They've never talked to vapors. You know, that's outrageous if you're actually practicing public health. So anyway, we ended up with legislation that was influenced a lot by the abstinence-only people. So rather than seeing vaping as here's this breakthrough that we can more rapidly reduce cigarette smoking, we can tremendously increase the liability for cigarette companies misbehaving by continuing to sell cigarettes and not telling people the truth about relative risk, et cetera. We ended up with legislation that was largely aimed at, oh my gosh, what if vaping's a problem? We better limit it. And this is the thing of, you know, General Patton had a wonderful line about there's no such thing as an obstacle, only a new opportunity. We end up with too many people whose view of the world is there's no such thing as a new opportunity, just another darn obstacle. So they weren't seeing the tool that we had and what we could do. So I think we ended up with legislation far less effective than what we could have had. We could have reduced smoking far more by now had we used it. In fact, if we had been able to retain the Tobacco Products Control Act that was passed into law in 1988, Section 17(1), which I happen to have drafted, was a harm reduction section. I think smoking would largely have been over in Canada by now, simply by retaining that and continuing to move in that direction. So there's a bit of background, and we ended up with the law. They had to come up with regulations under the law. I think the law itself has some very serious flaws, but the law also in Section 60 has a provision that they must do an evaluation of the law after 3 years, and that's what we're at now. So regardless of what you see from what Health Canada is saying, here's what we want feedback on, what they have to do is reevaluate this law. And we can all send in information about things that they should keep in mind. So for instance, Maria running a vape shop, the law says, section 30.43, that if somebody from my hometown, the people I grew up with who's smoking, goes in and says to Maria, Maria, I've seen your shop for a long time, and I've had friends die from smoking. I'm really concerned about my smoking. Would I actually reduce my risk if I switch to vaping? And it's illegal for her to answer that question. For something like snus, which we know with decades of research is not just less hazardous than cigarette smoking, but so low in risk, it's very hard to find any difference in risk between long-term users of snus and people who've never used a tobacco product at all. And if you decided you want to make snus available to Canadians who smoke as a way of reducing their risks, and you told them the truth about relative risk, you could go to jail. And they call that public health law. So I think we have major flaws in legislation that takes that sort of approach, that sees vaping as something that we have to limit it. And when we do public health, we try to do trade-offs, risks and benefits. And to say that we're cautious about vaping, I think, and you can see this in the Health Canada documents where they'll say, there's some evidence that it's less hazardous. It may reduce risk. Well, let's put this in perspective, because Health Canada is telling us 48,000 Canadians die every year as a direct result of cigarette smoking. Probably most of us on this call know people who are among that number for the years. Some of us have sat with people while they're dying, often at a very young age, people that we grew up with, because of their lung cancer or other diseases that they got. Cigarette smoking will kill over half of long-term users. This isn't a matter of saying it might be harmful. And yet the research that Health Canada itself has with current smokers and people who have recently quit show that a great many of them don't think smoking's all that hazardous. After all this time, they don't know. And they don't know that vaping is much less hazardous, in part because they're not being told that. And so we have a law that says people like Maria aren't allowed to tell people the truth in her store about relative risks. And it says the only thing you're allowed to tell people about the relative risk of vaping and cigarettes is what Health Canada specifically allows you to say through regulation. Then they never published any regulations. So here we are in a liberal democracy, 48,000 deaths a year because of cigarette smoking. We have legislation that bans truthful communication of information that could save lives, with the proviso that Health Canada could let you know some things you're allowed to say. And again, imagine that, it's Canada. And somebody has to authorize what you're allowed to say, rather than saying you can tell the truth, we'll just go after you if you lie. And then they didn't pass any regulations. So we see all this information, and I think this is part of the feedback when you talk to your friends, talk to people who are smoking cigarettes. What do they believe about relative risk? Because it isn't a matter of saying that vaping, there's some emerging evidence that vaping might be less hazardous than cigarette smoking. That's like saying, there's some emerging evidence that playing catch with a baseball may be less hazardous than doing it with live hand grenades. Is that truthful? Is that adequately communicating relative risk? How much do we really know about the science, and what should we be doing? So I think these are the sorts of points that many of you want to make about what have they got wrong, and what could they do better in this legislation? How do we take something like alternative nicotine delivery and turn it into a huge part of the solution to the epidemic of death and disease caused by cigarette smoking? How do we take the insights that, and I'm just seeing reference to the Royal College of Physicians, like the Royal College of Physicians telling us that, it's very unlikely vaping products are any more than 5% the risk of cigarette smoking. How do we communicate that to people? How do we empower them to make better decisions? How do we use this technology and use information to accomplish a really basic thing that was in a book somebody gave to me right at the beginning of my career, as I'm looking at how do you deal with problems like cigarette smoking? And it made the case that people can only make as good a decision as the information available to them allows. And it's simply not on to give people inadequate information to make an informed decision and then hold them responsible for having made a bad decision. So now when I see people who are smoking cigarettes as I walk through my neighborhood or back in my hometown, I think it's not their fault. They weren't given truthful information. They have not been empowered to make informed decisions about their health. And their own governments have stood in the way of them having that information. People who call themselves health groups have stood in the way of having them have that information. And 48,000 are going to die this year because of that. Now, how do we change that? How do we reevaluate this legislation? How do you get your own stories in? And vapors have played a huge role in this to date, whether Health Canada is paying attention to them yet or not. I think Health Canada is starting to. But on the nicotine regulations, there were tens of thousands of submissions from vapors themselves about the role that the different nicotine levels played. On the current, the regulations that are, where they're currently looking at submissions on flavors, again, many thousands, I don't know the exact numbers, but the vast majority of the submissions were from people who oppose the bans on the flavors. They're from vapors. They're from people whose lives are on the line. They are the people that Health Canada would definitely listen to if we were talking about opioids, where they do outreach, they do engagement, they want to talk about lived experience. Talk about your lived experience. Talk about what it's like. If you've had people say to you, you shouldn't be vaping, that's as bad as smoking. If you've had friends who've gone back to smoking because they were convinced that vaping was more hazardous because of nonsense like EVALI, which I might mention Health Canada still has on their website. The fear of EVALI, and if you're concerned, you might want to avoid vaping. And keep in mind, EVALI was not only not caused by vaping nicotine products, it could not be. The science on it, the chemistry is you could not use vitamin E acetate to cut nicotine fluids. And even if it was chemically possible, it makes absolutely no sense because the nicotine is much cheaper than vitamin E acetate. And anybody who's involved in cutting a drug would know you don't use a more expensive cutting agent than the drug itself. So this is really like, having been charged or having been come under suspicion for a crime and you have the perfect alibi. I happened to be in the Vatican having dinner with the Pope at the time and he's willing to testify. And they say, well, we still can't dismiss this. That's just craziness, and that's misinformation. But if you know people who have gone back to smoking because of those sorts of scare stories, as I do, that can be part of what you say. What are we getting wrong in this legislation? But a key thing is that the document they've passed around has various questions they want people to answer. And if you've looked at it, they're very much in the category of, do you still beat your wife? They have a certain view of the world, and it's all about how do we further restrict vaping? Are we doing enough to protect kids? I mean, it's the whole moral panic thing. And they're saying it like those 48,000 deaths a year from cigarette smoking just don't even exist. It's only about vaping. It's only about kids. It's the sort of arguments people used to make about drug policy. You don't want a safe injection site. What if kids go in there and use it? It's the arguments that were made against sex education. Like, what if kids start getting interested in this and start having sex? You certainly don't want to have condoms available. I mean, we've laughed off these things in other areas eventually, and they come back again and again and again. It's that concept that Lisa McGurr talks about in her book, The War on Alcohol, where this constant attempt by people to use the power of the state to impose their moral views on the behavior of others. Well, we need to get past that. So you can help fill that in too, in responding to the government. You don't have to answer their silly questions. You can actually answer the questions they should have asked. You can raise the question about what they're doing with this legislation, why they're not embracing vaping, why they're not giving people truthful information, why they're trying to prevent other people from giving truthful information. That the importance of flavors, of nicotine levels, of giving people options, of not being authoritarian, but being participatory. It isn't a matter of just telling people, here's how you have to run your life. It's like, let's work together to find out what works. So that's not a quick overview, but that's a starting point, and we can move on to specific questions that the people have on vaping or the architecture of downtown Port Hope.
Okay. So we have some questions already. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring you in over with the question as a panelist, just so David could see you and you guys can have, the question can be asked face to face, and then I'll move you over as an attendee. So I have Richard Shaw here, and I'm going to allow you to talk, Richard. So that'll give you an opportunity to ask the question if you like. Richard, are you there? You can talk now. And if you want to turn on your camera, that's fine too. There's Richard.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thanks for taking the question. I understand what you're saying. What's always perplexed me is, what's the government thinking? Are they that naive that they just listen to what they're being told by the body orgs? Is there a money issue that's not being talked about, like what big tobacco owes the provinces that has to get settled at some point? I'm trying to understand the government's motivation, because I don't believe they're that stupid that they can't see the reality of vaping. So do you have any thoughts on the government's mindset?
Sure. Well, as you asked the question, Richard, I'm thinking of a sign that used to be hanging in the policy unit at 10 Downing Street in London, the Prime Minister's office, that I very much enjoyed seeing in times I was there, which is never attribute to malice that which can be adequately explained by stupidity. But in this case, I don't think it's pure stupidity. I think there are a lot of people who don't understand the basics. And we can see that in the Health Canada consultation document, where they talk about tobacco-caused deaths, tobacco-caused disease. Well, tobacco is a plant. It's not causing the disease. It's the smoking of tobacco leaf that's causing it. There's ways you can use tobacco products, including making vaccines, for instance, that are a very, very good thing. There's ways you can have extract the nicotine from tobacco products or from tobacco leaf. There's ways you can use tobacco to manufacture things like Swedish snus. If you can't even distinguish between tobacco and the use that causes the harm, that's a problem. That's naivety. If you've got people who have this conspiracy theory view of the tobacco industry and don't understand the tobacco industry, which is rife at Health Canada in my experience, that's a problem. But I think what we're running up against is something that is bigger than that, and it's a moral panic. So if you followed things like what's happened on drug policy, you need only think about what was done to scare people about drugs in order to get narcotics laws, back in the 30s, or what was done with things like crack babies in going after crack cocaine. The reefer madness on marijuana that many of us learned to laugh at university, but was a big deal. And indeed, many people went to prison for long periods of time for marijuana. There's now at least a half a dozen marijuana shops within a short walk of where I'm speaking from. It's very hard for governments to fight a moral panic. It's irresponsible for health groups to cause one, but they did. And media picks up on these things because an awful lot of media now is about clickbait. We do not have the sort of investigative journalists we used to have. We don't have the sort of media that was very useful early in my career in trying to change attitudes about cigarette smoking and take on the cigarette companies. We have people who like moral panics. They're easy to report on, but they get a lot of clicks. You can get people very upset. And emotion works in social media, modern media. So once you get that moral panic, and you've got groups that are constantly going in and talking to ministers, talking to members of parliament about, we've got this huge problem, and the children, and we have misuse of data, as many of you would know, and few people have time to look at that in detail. And if you've got what seem to be reputable organizations or people associated with a reputable organization telling you things, there's a tendency for people to believe it. So I think they got the agenda going on this moral panic view, like it's only about kids and vaping, and there's a huge problem. And of course, if they start vaping, they're going to start smoking cigarettes. So we're going to get all the cigarette smoking back. And like every other conspiracy theory, when you end up with evidence that is contrary to the view that they have, they simply ignore it. So, those, for instance, who attack snus, and I've seen this for decades, they'll come up with some scare story. Snus causes cancer. Well, you look at the evidence, say, no, it doesn't. Well, it causes lung cancer. You look at the evidence, no, it doesn't. Oral cancer, it causes oral cancer. And there's the evidence it doesn't. Pancreatic cancer, and it doesn't. Heart disease, heart disease, yeah, tooth decay, and they never acknowledge that they were wrong about anything. And you look at this, we see the same thing on vaping. The people who talked about formaldehyde, the people who talked about popcorn lung, and we could go through, and many of you have lived through this, just a succession of attacks. They're inevitably shown to be wrong, that were knowably wrong at the time people started using it. But how many of those people have ever come back and said, sorry about that, I was wrong. I was wrong on the science. They never do. And that's a sign that it's a moral campaign. It has nothing to do with the pursuit of truth. It's not scientific. And then that infects government because they're not hearing the other side. So there's many people who still think that it caused EVALI. They still think it causes popcorn lung. They still think that the formaldehyde issue is a huge cancer causer, and there's way more formaldehyde in vaping than in cigarettes. We still get garbage studies, trying to find some risk that can be hyped and totally out of context. So it's either wrong to begin with, or if there is some level of risk, they take it totally out of proportion. They do not compare it to the cigarettes. And again, there's the risk of catching the baseball. But if you don't look at this as an alternative to catching a live hand grenade, you're missing the point. So I think that has affected governments. I don't think it's the money. I don't think there's a big plot. I think we're just seeing the messy work of democracy, and the need for all of us to fight back to get good policy. And at the risk of going off on a different tangent, when we look at Ukraine now and what people are willing to do to fight for the principles of having a liberal democracy, well, we've got one. We should fight to retain it. We all have the ability to try to influence government, to take action, to try to push for what we consider to be right and just, and exercise our democratic principles. Don't give up on this. Other people are dying to try to get it. We can save a lot of lives by simply doing what we can to retain it.
Thank you, David. Richard, do you have a follow-up question, or are you good for now?
Well, I do have another question, but I don't want to hog.
Okay, well, why don't we do another question and then I'll go to the Q&A. So you,
Okay.
Okay.
Do you think there's any feasibility to taking TVPA and splitting it to the Tobacco Act and an NDS Act? Do you think, if presented properly, the way they like it presented, whether there would be any appetite to make that split so we can start getting that message that we really are different? It seems to me, by being in TVPA, being called a tobacco product, we have, that's one of our biggest problems. And maybe if we get that separation, like when we get into synthetic nicotine, there's no component that's derived from tobacco. So how can you even be called a tobacco product if there's no components of tobacco in your product?
Yes, yes.
Whereas an NDS Act could address synthetics as well as snus, as well as nicotine delivery in all forms, including gum. And that might not want to be taxed because there's no risk. It could all be sorted out properly if that separation was made. So do you think that's even remotely possible? Thank you very much.
Well, I think anything is possible, and they should be pushed on that. And I think if you focus on what it is you're trying to achieve, which is risk proportionate regulation. They can do that through different pieces of legislation. They can do that with one piece of legislation that just recognizes the differences in risk and seeks proportionate regulation. You know, we've seen that work really well. I mean, many of us will recall, at least those of us who are older, will recall the move from leaded to unleaded gasoline. And one that for a long time, there were campaigns in many places try to convince people to buy the unleaded. It only costs a little bit more. And think of what you'd be doing to save the health of your children and the animals and the plants and the planet. And as they say, those campaigns were phenomenally successful with everyone who drove an orange Volvo. Everybody else would say, if I can save 10 cents, I'm putting in the leaded. And then somebody brought their brain to work and say, why don't we change the taxes? So the unleaded is less expensive at the pump, and it caused a revolution. If you look at the data on what motivates people to switch from cigarettes to vaping, price plays a huge role. Information would probably play an even bigger role if you just give them the information. But imagine if we did the combination of giving people the best information we could on relative risk, and then using pricing and regulatory incentives to give the greatest marketplace disadvantage to the most hazardous products. How rapidly could we move people from cigarettes to vaping and other low-risk products? I wouldn't want to do legislation that looks at tobacco versus other forms of nicotine simply because there's some very low-risk forms of tobacco. And I would like to see legislation that recognizes that there are many types of products we don't even have on the market and should. So the idea of saying, well, we do have vaping, and I guess you can get smokeless tobacco in a few places, give people the most choices possible. You know, if you're wanting your kids to have a healthier diet, you don't say, I'll have one vegetable available. You know, what if they don't like that one? What if they prefer something else? We give people as many choices as we can. If you want people to be more physically fit, give them lots of opportunities for different things they can do. If we want to get people off cigarettes, let's try other things. And if we look at things like the nicotine pouches, the Zyn type products that have now captured over 10% of the total market in some Western US states, they're not even allowed in Canada. They're illegal here. Like, why would we do that? You know, why aren't we soliciting this? And to say, well, our legislation is set up in a way that they're caught in a loophole and they can't get in. Like, can you imagine if somebody made that argument about a COVID vaccine? Oh yeah, that Pfizer BioNTech one, yeah, that'll work really well, and it does in other countries, but you know, we just have this legislative barrier here, so there's nothing we can do. Well, you'd be damn sure they do something really quickly to say, we're not going to have more people dying of COVID, we're going to deal with this. And we don't have 48,000 people a year dying of COVID. We do have 48,000 people dying each year in Canada from cigarette smoking. Why isn't this an emergency? Why isn't the government acting on that? Why isn't it giving people more options? And I think that's a worthy thing to raise when talking about review of the legislation. You know, what are we doing in terms of giving people more options, better information, giving relative advantages to low-risk products, and monitoring it to make sure that we accomplish the best that we can in terms of moving people as rapidly as possible off combustion-based delivery, and doing what we can to prevent unintended consequences such as youth usage. But that's the same as we do with everything else. You know, when we have painkillers for people who have terminal cancer, you know, we don't say no because kids might get this and use it as a party drug. You say, we're going to make it available and we're going to try to reduce those unintended consequences, like kids using it as a party drug. We can do that. We do it on so many things. So I would push, you know, for good ideas, fresh thinking, and recognize some of the problems in the sort of legislative framework we have now, and the very cautious approach that Health Canada has taken to products that could revolutionize the business, revolutionize public health.
Thank you, David. We're not allowed to advertise because we have the same advertising restrictions as tobacco products. And it just blows my mind away why we aren't allowed to advertise in cigarette packages about vaping. Like that just blows my mind. Like, we can tell you all the risks about cigarettes, and that's mandatory, but why can't, and I think I've put this in every single one of my submissions, make cigarette companies put a little insert talking about vaping and relative risks in there. And like, they can choose 5 statements, but it has to be in there, not product oriented, not brand, just the practice of vaping. So anyways, I
mean, and again, when you're writing to Health Canada, I really do encourage everybody to, write in, write often. Don't give up, see what we can do. It was my former colleagues who think they're battling sin, who wanted to have a provision that banned comparative information so that you couldn't tell people about the differences in risk. The bodies that have most benefited from that are cigarette companies. And speaking as a lawyer who's been involved in successfully suing cigarette companies, I think the biggest risk they've ever had is one on product liability based on cigarettes being an unreasonably hazardous product. They know that they can meet their consumer needs with alternative products that were massively less hazardous. Failure to do that has bankrupted other companies in other sectors by they're selling an unreasonably hazardous product. So you have to tell consumers, you have to make these products available to consumers, or you're going to be held liable for the harm to those people. And if we tried to sue them now, they say, what do you mean? Why didn't we tell people about the difference in risk between our cigarettes and these other things? It was illegal. We weren't allowed to. Why didn't we market the sort of products that people would really like with the sort of flavors and nicotine levels that would really work? It was illegal. We weren't allowed to. So shucks, we just had to keep selling cigarettes and making money hand over fist. And as one of the cigarette executives said to me years ago, the biggest research and development challenge we've ever had is how do you build a wheelbarrow large enough to take home the money at the end of the day? It's an incredibly profitable business. It's an oligopoly selling an addictive product where they have a near monopoly. And we've been rewarding that. This legislation rewards them. It protects cigarette companies. So we could definitely change that. And I think it's absolutely absurd that I can say in a broadcast like this, if you're smoking cigarettes, for heaven's sakes, get into a shop like Maria's, get good information about vaping, try to vape instead, get off those cigarettes, because it's going to be one of the most important things you could do to improve your health. And I can say that. If Maria says it, she's in trouble. That's illegal. She can't because she's got a commercial interest. I mean, how insane is that? Banning truthful information that could save people's lives. Who's that protecting other than the cigarette companies? And the, moral certitude of some people who, clearly haven't thought through what they're trying to do on tobacco issues. So, yeah, I think pushing some of these things is saying there's some fundamental flaws in the legislation. They're not meeting the needs of the people whose lives they're trying to save. Many of you are among those people. You've experienced these products. You know what they can do. You're interacting with other people. The government needs to hear from you. They need to hear what they've done wrong, what they've done right, and how do we do things better, because it's time to review this legislation.
Thank you, David, because I just want to share this, because when I saw the review document, I was personally very disappointed. It just looked like a review of how did we do our job, because everything they asked for was mandates that the Prime Minister made. Like, that's the way I saw it. Like, I could trace back every single mandate, and kind of like, how did we hold up to the mandates that we were given? Did we do a good job? Because that's like kind of the way I read it.
Yeah.
And I felt instinctively, my first thought was, without critical thinking, without anything, was, oh, I have to answer these exactly how they are. But after thinking and speaking to other people, I realized I can answer any way I want. This is just a guided document, and I have to critically think how I'm going to respond.
Yeah.
Okay. So
understandably, they don't want to admit they were wrong, right? That's a human characteristic. So rather than saying we clearly messed up on a lot of what we've done on vaping, they're acting like, we've done this great. We just ought to do more of it, right? I mean, it's like, I remember a Woody Allen story about a guy who goes to listen to a symphony in Vienna, and he's got a box seat. He's right at the very front, and he gets ever more engrossed in the symphony, ever more, and he's listening, he's leaning forward, and eventually he tumbles out onto the seats below him. And he's so embarrassed thinking people might think he did this by accident that he immediately buys tickets to the next 10 performances and falls out exactly the same way at exactly the same point of the performance. So people didn't think the first one was a mistake. And I think we run into a bit of that. And yeah, we need to counter it.
Okay, so we have some questions here. So they're doubling down.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so this is from Jackie. What are David's thoughts in terms of ads run by Tobacco Free Kids, PAVE, and other Bloomberg influence organization who run ads showcasing puppets, teens, and cartoons using vapor products in an attempt to sway youth away from the products, including doing Marvel comics, and then screaming youth epidemics, yet they're advertising it to teens and young children. And I'm going to add here in a language that they relate to. And it's very similar to the dare aimed from cannabis use, like when you were talking about reefer madness. Those ads did the direct opposite. They promoted everyone is doing it towards the teens. Like, do they not learn from their past? Or are they all just stuck in 1980?
Or not want to? I mean, and things repeat themselves, right? So the same as this view of how people constantly want to use the power of the state to impose their moral views and the behavior of others. We've seen this show before, right? So many of the things that were done to try to dissuade young people from trying marijuana were a really effective way of promoting marijuana use. One of the examples I have, this is a Port Hope story. My mother, having grown up in a farm that's been in my family for 220 years or something, just outside of town, and mom's now almost 100. When she was in Sunday school, they had somebody come in to talk to the teenagers about alcohol. And remember, this would be like the early 30s. And the message they gave, now can you imagine you're talking to teenagers, farm country outside Port Hope, about alcohol. What do you say? This is the Women's Christian Temperance Union or one of those groups. So what they say is never try alcohol at all. It's the thing of the devil. And the reason why you never try it is because it tastes so good. It tastes better than anything you will have ever had in your entire life. It tastes so good that if you have any of it at all, you'll probably never be able to stop drinking it. We're still getting the same stuff, saying you don't want to try vaping because it'll make you look really cool, and it comes in all sorts of nice flavors that you can have, and you'll be popular at school, and all the other kids are doing it, of course, and you can hide it, and oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And you know, I remember in grade 8 in Port Hope having somebody from the health unit come to talk to us about cigarette smoking, and by grade 8 in Port Hope, at least half of my classmates were already smoking cigarettes. Some of them died since then from it, but she was matronly. She didn't look at all like anybody we'd identify with. Her presentation style was such that we're thinking, who is this person? She is so uncool. And she even brought her pack of cigarettes out to show us what they look like, so we'd know what cigarettes look like in order to avoid them. So, you know, everybody who wasn't already a smoker wanted to go out and smoke at recess. And I don't think that's any different than what we're seeing from Tobacco Free Kids, except Tobacco Free Kids has a tremendous amount of money from the Bloomberg organization. Michael Bloomberg deciding being abstinence only is a really good idea on a product with such a huge continuum of risk. And this is the same Tobacco Free Kids that says we're doing this to fight the tobacco industry, but who partnered with the tobacco industry to get the master settle agreement that protected the tobacco industry from litigation? Tobacco Free Kids. Who was the group who partnered with Altria, the biggest seller of cigarettes in the United States, that didn't have anything other than cigarettes and had the most to lose from any product that could replace cigarettes? And they needed FDA regulation. Who worked with Altria to get legislation that actually protected cigarettes? Tobacco Free Kids. I mean, are they stupid? Are they counterproductive? I mean, what's going on there? But they're causing huge damage. And I think, you know, the net result of the Bloomberg funding on tobacco globally is a huge negative. You know, it's doing things that's actually adding to the death toll rather than reducing it. And I think we see this from a lot of the groups. And there's a wonderful line from the late historian Robert Conquest that the best way to understand most organizations is to assume that they're being run by a secret group of their opponents. So if you're dealing with a group like Tobacco Free Kids, if you believe they're actually being run by people in the tobacco industry, their actions start to make sense. You know, if you believe that the Heart and Stroke Foundation is being run by a group of people who really want to promote more heart disease, their actions make sense. I mean, it's a very cynical view of the world, and unfortunately, it often fits.
And you know, here in Canada, I just reach out to anybody that has an opinion on vaping, whether it aligns with my beliefs or it counters my beliefs. And I find that most people that counter my beliefs, and this is where my issue is, where we're not having conversation. Let's take Health Canada out of the, well, no, we can't take Health Canada because some of these groups are funded by Health Canada, but they claim 5.3. I can't talk to you. You own a vape shop, 5.3. How much truth is that? Like, why are we being guided by 5.3? Even with the vaccine, like, we have a vaccine that is low cost, but oh my God, a tobacco company, and it's made from a tobacco plant. And like, how much power does who have over how our health is regulated and promoted in our own country?
Well, you're talking about the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. There is nothing that enforces those rules on Canada, and 5.3 does not say that. 5.3 says you want to have some sunshine on this. If tobacco companies are in trying to influence policy, you should know about it. If somebody's trying to influence you and it's funded by the tobacco industry, you should know about it. You know, so that affects your ability to do good policy. They then came up with rules in their conferences of the parties where they do not let in anybody other than themselves. They don't even let in media, unlike the Conference of the Parties on climate change. So you've got people who are already extreme getting together to try to come up with rules. And even then, the rules aren't as extreme as they're now trying to say, which is that you can't have any sort of contact. And you're right, the vaccine stuff gets absolutely absurd because, and I've encountered this with WHO deciding they were going to blacklist anybody from the University of Ottawa, which has like thousands of employees, including a leading researcher on COVID, who was supposed to be going to a meeting, a Cochrane evaluation on what we've learned from COVID, and saying he can't go because he's with the University of Ottawa and the World Health Organization won't let him because David Sweanor is at the University of Ottawa and he's criticized WHO and he's supported harm reduction.
Okay, that's ridiculous.
Well, I mean, collective punishment, fighting against intellectual freedom, academic freedom. I mean, that is over the top. But when you look at their rule, it says anything that could support the interests of the tobacco or arms industry, anything. So by their interpretation, if a tobacco company owns a 20% interest in a company that has developed an effective vaccine for COVID, WHO can't have anything to do with them. Well, what if it's a 1% interest? What if it's one share? Or, as I've pointed out in trying to deal with WHO on this, that if you're saying something that could benefit any part of the tobacco industry, and they include vaping as being part of that, that means if I say, if you're smoking cigarettes, you should switch to vaping, they're saying I'm in violation of the rule because that's helping somebody in the vaping industry. But of course, when the crazy part of the anti-smoking community says you shouldn't vape, they're helping the cigarette industry, right? If you say, I think snus should be available in the European Union, you're helping the people who make snus. If you say, I think it should be banned, you're helping the cigarette companies. You can't help but have an impact on them because it's such a huge market with so many players and different products. Obviously, the people at WHO who drafted the rule don't understand the industry they're trying to deal with. And it gets more ridiculous than that to say, it doesn't even have to be about tobacco products. Like, what if they do something with a bank? They put their deposits in a bank. Well, isn't that benefiting the tobacco industry? So you can't have anything to do with that bank? What if they buy Coca-Cola? People at, a tobacco company like drinking Coca-Cola. Does that mean nobody can have anything to do with Coca-Cola? And it's just this absolutist rule that, does sound like people are dealing with sin. It looks like you're dealing with the Spanish Inquisition. The good news is that Canada doesn't have to follow that stuff any more than we have to follow the international narcotics protocols that say there's no way you can decriminalize marijuana. That's not allowed. Well, take a look around our towns, right? We did that. We did it because what they were saying didn't make any sense. When they say there's no way you can have a safe supply of drugs like for narcotics, or safe injection sites. They just all have to be illegal. And we look at the evidence and we say public health is more important than what a bunch of people sitting around somewhere else some time ago decided we should do. We're going to do what's good for the public health of Canadians. And we go on justice rather than on somebody's rules that they wrote while not knowing what they were talking about. So we don't need to pay any more attention to their crazy interpretations of Section 5.3 of the Framework Convention on Tobacco than we have to pay to their international narcotics protocols. If 5.3 was really doing what they want it to do, which completely shutting down the ability to have intelligent discussions about ending that 48,000 deaths a year, we don't want that rule. Canada doesn't want a rule like that. We want to protect the lives of Canadians. Fortunately, that isn't what the rule actually says. They can adhere to the rule and still have vaccines. They can adhere to the rule and talk to people who run vape shops. They can learn about what's going on in the market. They can even talk to people in tobacco companies and learn from them, and they should. One of the best ways to find out what's going on within the industry is to talk to all the different players, all of whom want to rat out their competitors or have insights on what's going on in the market. What you try to do is triangulate, get as much information from as many places as possible. So yeah, we can't just let things like that get in the way and have somebody say it's an absolutist thing, because it really is like somebody saying, the local minister says you can't do that. Great, but I'm not a member of his church. And if he did say that, just a sign he doesn't know what he's talking about. And speaking of that, I was, in Port Hope when a local minister wrote an article about how we keep homosexuals out of Port Hope, got to prevent them from getting in. That was in the 1970s. Many of us decided to ignore people like that. What he was saying didn't make any sense. He couldn't get away with saying it now, but the same thing. If people are saying nonsensical stuff, ignore them or get around them, but certainly don't adhere to it if the cost of doing that is measured in other people's lives.
Okay, thank you. Miriam Bird has a question. She says the text of the TVPA in 2018 said that the goal was partly to allow access to vapes for smokers. How has that somehow been erased from the act?
Yeah, good point. I mean, it's there, and that was the goal. So we start off from saying we've got these 48,000 deaths a year. We really want to deal with it. We've got alternative products that can help us deal with it, but those alternative products have the potential for unintended consequences. How do we control for that? That was all logical. That's what you do for public health. And then somehow that got distorted into saying, let's only look at the unintended consequences.
Yeah, and let's only look at make believe. Like let's focus on the what ifs.
Yeah.
And here's the thing that blows my mind away. When someone is in addiction, the one thing you learn once you start working with your addiction is don't worry about the what ifs. Focus on what's happening now.
Yes.
And you have all these people who claim to be supporting people with their addiction and have no concept of the very principles of how recovery works.
Yes.
It blows my mind away.
Well, I think we need to get more people who have a background working in these other issues. We need to get more expertise on basic public health issues. We actually need to get the people within Health Canada who are dealing with issues like marijuana and opioids to talk to their brethren who are within the same section of Health Canada who are dealing with tobacco and taking an entirely different counterproductive stance. We need to understand first order, second order points. So if you say, we would really like to see Canadians be more active, getting out for walks and runs and bicycle rides is a good idea. Now, if we do that, there's the risk of unintended consequences. What if people, fall down, hurt themselves, get too much sun, get a sunburn, etc.? Do you then turn it into, my gosh, what we need to do is make sure people don't get sunburn. So we should ban anybody from being outside the house between 10 in the morning and 4 o'clock in the afternoon because we don't want the sunburns, right? I mean, that's the issue, to say, no, we're trying to get people to be fit and we're trying to control the unintended consequences. Why don't we talk about sunscreen? Why don't we talk about hats? But for heaven's sake, so let's not lose the big gain that we could have because of focusing on some, tiny little thing instead. Most of life can be explained by Monty Python, but the scene from the Holy Grail with the king and his wimpish son, and the king is gesturing out the window to say, and son, someday, all of this is going to be yours. And the kid says, the curtains? And I think that's what we need to avoid here. They're looking at the curtains. They're not looking at the kingdom. The kingdom is at 48,000 deaths a year. The curtains is what might go wrong with vaping. We can control for that. We can do things to deal with the unintended consequences and get that reward. And we can follow up, because anybody taking up vaping now, we have a low risk activity. We have lots of time to intervene. All the deaths that we're going to see this year and next year and the next 10 years are people already smoking cigarettes, most of whom say, I wish I didn't do this. We have solutions. We have products that could replace them. They would no longer be modeling the smoking to their kids and the other people around them. This is a huge gain. We can do that. That should be the first order point. And then we start focusing on, and how do we reduce unintended consequences? Well, we do it, but let's grab the initiative. Let's do something big, and let's push Health Canada to do that, because we have the ability to get to have a breakthrough of historic proportions, and substitution works. This is the stuff I've written about in Japan, where in the last 5 years, cigarette sales are down 42% in a major market, 42%. Why? Primarily because they got an alternative and people moved to a non-combustion product. And we've seen that in other countries. Norway reduced smoking by half in 10 years. Based on some reports, it looks like Iceland reduced smoking by 40% in just 3 years. In Lithuania, heated tobacco products got to be over 30% of the market in about 3 years. People will switch. And it isn't like, putting out safer automobiles means people will just drive more and mainly drive the unsafe ones, is that they switch. People switch. It isn't that because of the access to condoms, people just had massively more sex. It's that they had safer sex. We've seen these changes with people moving to having pure water. It isn't like they're still going out and getting the stuff out of the ditch. They're drinking the pure water. They're having the sanitary food. They're on the airplanes that don't fall out of the sky. We change from one behavior, one activity, one service to another based on risk, based on the information we can get on it. We have the chance to do the same thing here. It's not rocket science. So we can influence it, but Health Canada really needs to hear from you. And because of the inbuilt advantage to the moral panic people, they need to hear a lot more from sensible people and the people whose lives are on the line, the people with the lived experience, in order to make up for what they're hearing from the people who want to run in circles and scream about any potential downsides.
Thank you, David. Okay, we have another question here. How important would you say personal stories, life experiences are when making this submission to Health Canada?
I think they're very important. As a species, we pay an awful lot more attention to stories than we do to facts. And if I tell you the stats on how many Canadians are dying from cigarette smoking, that probably won't have as much influence as if I tell you what it was like sitting beside a friend who wasn't yet 50 in a palliative care ward the day before he died because of his smoking. You're going to remember that. That's a story. That's a real person. He coached the kids' hockey team. He's gone. We remember stuff like that, and for good reason. We care about people. Tell them your story. Tell them what it's like. Tell them the stories of other people. Why can't people have access to safer products? Why aren't they giving people more information about this? Why can't people tell the truth about relative risk? How many more people have to be in those palliative care wards unnecessarily, prematurely? And I know that the submissions that went from vapors on things like nicotine levels and flavors were hugely influential for many people. I had people telling me that they were really moved. They were getting lived experience. That's so important. That's what we look for when the government's dealing with policy on things like opioids. What's it like to hear from the mother of a kid who died from an overdose? What are we going to do about it? Tell them your story, tell them your life, your lived experience. I mean, it's important. They should be listening to it. And they know that for everyone who writes in, there's probably thousands more like you. And so, yeah, I definitely push that as much as you can.
Thank you. The other question we have here, what do you think about a tax on vaping products?
Crazy idea. I actually co-authored a piece in the New England Journal of Medicine with the two leading health economists specializing on tobacco issues in the world, Ken Warner and Frank Shalupka, back in 2015, talking about the importance of differential pricing. And again, this is similar to what we had in moving people from leaded to unleaded gasoline in so many countries. The government's talking about putting a tax on. We know from economics that you do get substitution between goods, what they would call it's cross elasticity. You know, the price of oranges go up, but apples go down, more people move to the apples. If you were really trying to get people to move from one product category to the other, you want the biggest price differential you can get, because, you know, in economics, it's a slope. You know, the bigger the price differential, the more people are going to move. So the idea of saying we're going to tax this because it's hazardous makes no sense. If you're in a place where people were playing catch with hand grenades and you're trying to introduce baseballs, you don't want the baseballs to be expensive. You don't even want them to be half the cost of the hand grenades. You'd actually like to hand them out for free. Maybe pay people to use them instead of the hand grenades. You want to make it as big a differential as you can. So why would you want to do something like that, to say we're going to put a burden on the industry? And I know tobacco companies have actually argued for taxes on vaping products, even a really low tax, because it's a huge burden on their competitors, the small vaping companies who now have to deal with bonded warehouses and excise regimes, et cetera. You don't want the hassles. You want to get more of these products out to more people. Maybe once we get rid of all the cigarettes, they can look at whether they want to tax this as opposed to taxing something else. But at this point, you know, what you're really doing is making it less likely that people are going to move from one to the other because of the price differential.
I'm starting to think that, you know, this was a directive from the Prime Minister. It's one of his mandates. The only mandate he did on vaping this round was to the Minister of Finance to tax vaping products. Maybe he just doesn't want them around. Like, that's just what it feels like. Like, every mandate has been prohibition, 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 like to the point of like, let's make these so unappealing to adults. Let's create a black market. And that's kind of where we're going. And, you know, I'm disappointed because I truly believe that the spirit of TVPA was balance. And ever since it got stamped and got its royal assent, we didn't get balance.
Yeah. Yeah. Moral panics can do that, right? Politicians respond to it. We have a long history of that. When you look at what has been orchestrated in the United States to have the Parents Against Vaping, it's very similar to the organizations of Parents Against Marijuana Use that reignited the whole war on drugs approach. The crack baby stuff, which was erroneous information, but it ended up causing an awful lot of low-income people to go to prison for long periods of time. It created a moral panic. So politicians are susceptible to that sort of stuff, and they're being lobbied by the people who are anti-vaping, the abstinence-only, prohibitionist, moralists, ill-informed conspiracy theorists sorts. Not that I have opinions on them. And when they're only hearing from that side, it's not surprising. Like if you've got two kids and they're having a fight and only one of them comes to tell you what was going on, don't count on getting an accurate story. They need to be hearing from others. They really need to be hearing from those of you on this call, other vapors. I don't think there's evil intent. I think if they're listening to CBC and getting this incredibly jaundiced view of what's going on with vaping, it's not surprising that they're receptive when somebody tells them this is a huge problem, this is what we have to deal with. If they're picking up on the media from the United States and keeping in mind the hundreds of millions of dollars that's being spent to create this prohibitionist attitude toward vaping, it's not surprising that they get this. And in fact, the idea that you've got an incredibly wealthy American with an abstinence-only view on a product influencing policy is not a big change from, look at alcohol prohibition and John D. Rockefeller funding the the anti-alcohol people, until he finally started to understand how crazy that was and moved sides, and things changed. Michael Bloomberg hasn't moved sides yet, but he's spending an awful lot of money. So I would like to hold the politicians to greater account, but I think they are subject to the what they're seeing in the media and the moral panic. But I'd also say that when you look at the politicians who have line authority here, like Dr. Carolyn Bennett, who oversees this section of Health Canada on substance use, mental health, she gets harm reduction. She's supportive. I mean, when they put out this consultation document, look at what she said in the news release, because she is talking about, and I think I have it here, vaping provides adults using tobacco with a less harmful source of nicotine, and for many, a way towards tobacco cessation. Is now pivotal to hear from Canadians on the role of vaping in quitting and the risk of vaping. She's interested because it's the same thing that she'd be saying if she was talking about opioids, and she does. When she talks about safe supply, when she talks about safe injection sites, clean needles, it's the same thing. She's a doctor. She's been interested in this stuff for a long time. She's receptive. She should hear from you.
I completely 100% agree. I think one of the biggest things that's happened, and I don't know if Marianne wants to come in and talk about it, has been a couple of consumers, end users have connected with Health Canada, and Marianne has taken task to start trying to help and bring names forward to start a consumer advisory board. I don't know, Marianne, do you want to jump in and share that with us? I'm just going to make you, did she leave? Hold on, where is she? Sorry, just give me oh, yes, she does. Okay, I'm moving you over to panelists, Marianne. You can jump in. Because I think that's a really big deal, and that's from the efforts of consumers choosing to speak up. Oh, there's Marianne with the cat.
You look different.
You just have to unmute yourself, Marianne. The joys of Zoom. I personally think this is such a huge deal. Like, it's the first time since the regulation TVPA came into effect.
There we go.
Here I am, more recognizable.
Yeah.
If I'd known, I would have put lipstick on.
You look
I forgot to.
Yeah, thank you. Can I tell my little story? I wrote to them and I got a reply, and I started reading it, and it was like 4 or 5 paragraphs of caring about youth and youth protection. And I thought, the usual bump, and I put it somewhere. I didn't even finish reading it. And then David sent me an email saying, could you get in touch with her? And so I went back, dug it out of the junk pile. And there in the last line was an invitation. So I connected, I sent a couple of emails, and she responded. Well, she lost my first one, but the second one, she answered me within the hour. And so we had a Zoom conversation. And yeah, she talked about setting up this panel of consumers. And so I put posts in several Facebook groups. And thank you, Maria, for Rights for Vapors, for putting my request there, because I've been getting volunteers coming into my inbox. And I now have 12. Some I know, some I don't know. But what I did was I thought it was really important, after reading that Cynthia from the Physicians for Smoke-Free Canada, I thought it was really important that we be squeaky clean and have no affiliations at all, so that nobody can accuse us of being tobacco or vape shills. And I also asked people if they wanted to give me their brief history. And I'll tell you, I have been so moved reading these, and I don't know you know, whatever, I don't know what this is going to end up as. But I thought, this is such wonderful ammunition. But I am so excited about this. You know, to actually be able to talk to somebody in Health Canada as a consumer, because we have been ignored for so long, you know? And you know what? I told her about my lifetime supply of nicotine in my basement freezer. And I loved her face when I said that. And and I told her about the student I had when I was teaching, the Chinese student, and I showed him my vape when we met in the smoking section outside the Oisey building. And a week later, he came to me and said he had bought a vape, and he had called his mother in China to tell him that he had stopped smoking because he switched to vaping, and his mother was crying with joy. And I told that to, what's her name? I've forgotten it.
Mhm.
Sonia, and she liked that. So I'm hoping that, I think I said to Ivana today that I feel like Robin Hood getting my merry band of men and women together to rob from the NGOs. So, yeah.
I'm
So
super proud of you, Marianne.
Yeah.
I
I'm
mean,
having fun. I'm
I,
having fun.
but I do think people should know, if Marianne, this isn't the first email that Marianne sent. Marianne has been sending emails for since 2014.
Yeah.
Like, you've been at this since 2014, and you know, you never miss an opportunity. And I know not everybody has the time or has the ability to write as eloquently and as descriptively, but it doesn't have to be that. Your voice matters. Your
And I'll
voice
tell you what, I post a lot of what I write, and it's not copyrighted. So you can grab anything that I write with my blessing. Anyone who wants to write something, or just write your own, because vapors who have escaped from smoking are speaking from their heart. And whatever the grammar or the punctuation, it doesn't matter, because it's the story and it's the joy that we all feel. And that's the message that has to be passed across to them. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Marianne. Do we have any more questions? You can raise your hand. You can put it in the Q&A. I know that David went really into detail about everything. Okay, I have a couple of questions. I just want people to know they don't have to write a novel. David, like, I think people are intimidated that they have to write a novel, or they see experts doing things. Like, what's the best advice you can give people when it comes to giving feedback here? Like, it can be short and sweet, can it not?
Be yourself. We look at what happens with the opioid strategy, where they've been actively reaching out to people with lived and living experience. You don't have to send them a really articulate message. You know, when they get a message of what it's like as a mother, go into your kid's bedroom and your kid's dead. Do you have to say anything more? You know, when somebody says, well, what it's like to be able to have found vaping, and that your friends, your colleagues, people you know who didn't switch, what have you seen happen to them? Or the misinformation. What's it like when you tell somebody, as you know, we're seeing experience now in Ukraine of people saying our city's being bombed by the Russians, and their relatives in Russia say, no, it's not. You know, that gaslighting stuff, or that, I just don't believe you. Like, what's it like when you tell somebody you can really reduce your risk by switching to vaping, and they don't believe you because they've heard about Evalai, or they've heard about formaldehyde, or they're like everybody else that you see in the surveys that Health Canada itself runs. Like, what percentage of Canadians believe that vaping is significantly less hazardous than smoking cigarettes. The latest data I saw is about 2 years old, so before EVALI hit, and it got worse. It was 4.3%. 4.3% of Canadians believe that. What if 4.3% of Canadians believe that throwing a baseball was safer than throwing hand grenades? Would we be okay with that? What if 4.3% of people engaging in risky sexual behaviors thought condoms could reduce their risk? 4.3%. Would that be all right? What if 4.3% of us believe wearing a seatbelt reduces your risk in a traffic accident? Would they be okay with that? I mean, that condemns them. Like, what have we done? And it is no different than what I encountered when I first got involved to find out what people believed about the hazards of cigarette smoking. They did not have the information they needed to make an informed decision. We went after the cigarette companies. We went after Health Canada to try to change that. And one of the barriers that we had is that it's very hard to convince people how deadly cigarette smoking is when they don't have an alternative to go to, because something like cognitive dissonance kicks in. If you don't believe you can do anything about this risk, but I'm just telling you it's going to kill you, you dismiss it because you've got nowhere to go. We now have somewhere for them to go. You know, we can tell people who smoke cigarettes just how deadly it is and what you can do about it, because we now have the alternatives. You know, why aren't we doing that? So I think getting that message to them, and you know, I deal with this at a global level and a policy level, but I also deal with it at a personal level with people I know who smoke cigarettes, people I've tried to get to move to alternative products. The experience I've had, including at a shop that's 2 floors below where I'm speaking to you from, that has a lot of young people working there, young women, many of them smoke cigarettes. Talking to them, virtually all of them switched to vaping till the scares came along. Now some of them are back to smoking. Whose fault is that? What should we do about it? You know, why would Health Canada not be very upset if they found out a lot of sexually active gay men had stopped using condoms because they thought latex allergies were a bigger risk than HIV? So I think getting the personal information, you know, your life, what you've experienced, it doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be, you know, Margaret Atwood level of articulation. Just tell them your story. And if you want, tell them stories about other people you know, and encourage other people to submit. And, you know, let's get this democratic process working the way that it can. And let's see if we can get effective legislation, and we can all be part of a solution to our leading cause of preventable death. I mean, I think it's empowering to be able to act like that and say, we can make a difference in the world. Don't give up. That, you know, there's an awful lot of gains to be made. And we look at the huge gains in life expectancy in the last 150 years. And where did it come from? It came from things like this, finding risk and reducing it. You know, where will we save the next million life years from things like this? You know, we have just this tremendous opportunity, and I think it's great that you've all tuned in. It shows that you care. You know, show that in writing Health Canada, there's a lot of people at Health Canada who care. It's not unanimous there. I mean, there's some people who clearly have bought into like crazy ideas, but a lot of people in key positions really care what you have to say. They want to listen to you. You know, give them the ammunition they need to try to push for more effective regulations.
I agree. Thank you. Thank you. I found this really inspiring and motivating. All the comments here, people are so thankful. They feel motivated to go out there. We just need to discuss this. The shops across, like, here's the thing. Shops are a library for information for consumers. Shops, like, you know, at your local shop, this is where you're going to learn about regulations. This is where you're going to learn about what you can do. You know, when you're going into the shop, let the people in there know as well, like the fellow customers and that. We just have to do this as word of mouth at this point, you know, not just on social media, but interacting with people. Everything is opened up again. Do that. I want to share something as a closing because it just happened today. There was a young man about 27 years old. He was a smoker. He started vaping in about 2017, and then he went back to smoking. He came in here, and I think he's 27, up to 3 packs a day. has a laborious job and it's out of boredom, fidgeting, he's smoking that much. So he switched to vaping. He came in and he told me he's down to 12 cigarettes a day, which is absolutely incredible. But he said he feels guilty vaping because he enjoys it and he shouldn't be enjoying it. And that is, and I looked at him and I said, so you would just feel okay smoking? Like, why, what's so wrong about that? And these are some of the stigmas that we're working through on top of everything else to keep people in a tobacco harm reduction product. They have guilt that they're enjoying vaping. Just blows my mind away.
Yeah. It's a sin.
It is. It's a sin. Sorry, that was my sarcastic
And
look.
yes, on any level of a hierarchy of morality, to say what's the sin in using nicotine when a great many people actually benefit from it, and how big a sin is it to condemn them to death for doing it by only allowing them to have access to a toxic product? Who's the greater sinner? And how do many of the people who take these moralistic positions act so immoral themselves?
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. If anybody has any, we've gotten all the questions, but if you need any studies or any more information, you guys can email me. You can use the info at Rights for Vapors, and I will get you all that info at rightsforvapors.com. And I'd give you my other email address, but I don't remember it. God, that's what happens when you get older, you forget. But thank you, David. We are so lucky and blessed to have someone like you, not only from Port Hope, because I'm just going to give a link, but you're supporting, like you're an expert around the world, but you're Canadian, and we're lucky to have someone like you fighting on our side.
All right, and I should declare a conflict of interest that Maria once gave my 98-year-old mother a piece of chocolate, which my mother greatly enjoyed. And that, of course, is the real reason that if she asked me to come on the show, I'm here. You won the heart of the woman who matters most to me, Maria.
Oh, I have to come see her now that everything's cut out.
She'll like that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everybody.